Well, I was pastor of the First Baptist Church in Bartow, Florida at that time, and I was very happy. Hadn't been there a long time, only about 11 months, and I was up in Virginia preaching revival at a church of one of my friends in Alexandria. And I'd come home each night, and I was troubled somehow in my spirit, and I know when God's churning me up on the inside for something, and so I came back the next night, got down to pray, and it's like the Lord said, I'm going to move you.
They put Felix on a search committee. And in this committee, they were looking for someone to preach on Sunday nights and minister to young adults. And that's when God brought Charles Stanley to his mind.
I'd never heard of Charles Stanley, and I don't know that I'd ever heard of Bartow, Florida. So to tell you the truth, I wondered what could come out of Bartow, Florida.
So Monday morning, I got up and was in my study, and the telephone rang. And it was a fellow friend of mine who is a member of First Baptist here, and he was then. And Felix Snipes is his name, and he said, Charles, how you doing? And so we talked a few moments. He said, well, I want to talk to you about something you never thought about. I said, what's that? He said, we need an associate pastor here at First Baptist, and you're the only person that's come to my mind, and we've been looking around, and I believe you're the man. I said, oh, no, Felix, it couldn't be me.
So Felix said, well, Charles, why don't you just pray about it?
I said, well, I'll pray about it, but I'll have to admit, I didn't intend to pray much. I wasn't going to be into fasting and praying about something that I didn't want to do. I hung up the phone and broke out crying.
Then the committee went down, heard him, felt he was the one, and extended the call.
Reluctantly, September, I moved to Atlanta, complaining all the way up here, and I knew before I came it was going to be difficult.
When my dad began to preach, he was just better than the senior pastor. He was more biblical, he was more interesting, he was more applicational, and so people loved to hear him preach, so much so that they preferred to hear him preach. And that's a problem in the local church, when the second string is stronger than the first string.
And the church began to grow, and people started joining the church, and things began to move, and the church had been dead.
So then the pastor resigned, and Charles was voted to be interim pastor.
So while they were searching for a senior pastor, my dad was doing all the preaching, and the church was growing. And once again, that's problematic for bringing somebody else in.
There were 5 to 7 men that ran the church, and these men that ran the church were deacons, and they were members of every committee.
These 7 men controlled everything. And what really got started against me, I guess, is we had a meeting one night. I had no authority. And we were discussing something, and I said, well, why don't we just pray about this? And one of these men said, this is business. Leave God out of this. Well, that was the beginning of our conflict. And so they worked diligently to get rid of me.
The way I remember it, a business meeting had been called, and I don't know if you've ever been to a church business meeting. They're never very positive things if something major is being decided.
The chairman of the pulpit committee said, I don't want to be having this meeting because we know who's the pastor's going to be.
So on this particular evening, the decision that was to be made was, do we allow Dr. Stanley to remain as the associate pastor while we look for a senior pastor, or should we ask him to leave?
Well, what happened, we all got there because the church wanted him, but they wouldn't put his name up for us to vote.
They wouldn't even allow Becky and Andy, his children, to be in the business meetings. That's how low things got. But I could be in there. And so I would, prop myself up in the balcony, and something would happen, and I would scurry down to Dr. Stanley's study and relay that to Andy and Becky. You're not going to believe what just happened. And then I would hustle back up to the balcony.
So all during this 2.5 or 3 hour meeting, he was back and forth, giving us updates as to what was happening.
In the meantime, Charles Stanley was over on the side in the wings, reading his Bible and praying.
Someone says, I nominate Charles Stanley, somebody seconded, and somebody called for a vote. And that's how he got in First Baptist Church.
The people, the fellowship of First Baptist Church, outvoted the power structure that was there. And they called him as pastor of First Baptist Church that very day.
I think all of that was because there was a man of faith who had come on the scene. And a man of faith threatens the enemy more than anyone else. And fortunately, God prevailed.
When I think about how God used all of that, I see it as God building into my life a solid, immovable, unquestionable reliance upon Him. Because in those days, I had to rely upon Him for everything.
Think about it. These people were still in leadership positions. They were the Sunday school teachers. They were deacons. They still, quote, ran the church.
So one Wednesday night, I called for a surprise business meeting. And the Sunday school superintendent, who was an Army colonel and really tough, I asked the church to give he and myself full authority to appoint all church officers, deacons, teachers, everybody.
One of the deacons and a Sunday school director wanted to speak to this subject.
So he talked about how I was stealing the church and running them away, and it was their church, and they were here before I was. And
he went on and was really bad-mouthing Dr. Stanley, real bad.
And my dad walked up beside him and said, "We're not going to have that kind of language." I remember exactly where I was sitting when this happened.
He said, "And if you don't watch out, Stanley, you're going to get hurt." And he backhands me and hits me in the jaw. Well, it didn't even stun me.
I never knew him to lose his composure in all of that. Even the day he was punched in the face in the pulpit, when deep down in my heart, I wanted him to turn around and knock that guy off the pulpit.
There was one little old man that had his walking stick, and he wasn't using a walking stick. He was coming down the aisle holding that walking stick. He was coming after that guy for hitting his pastor, you know.
Well, people were crying and so forth, and we voted and won again, so it was my authority to appoint all the officers.
Right after that was the big Sunday. And on that particular Sunday, all of the Sunday school workers that were against Charles Stanley and all the directors and all the people had gotten together and said, at a certain time, we're going to resign our positions and we're going to leave.
I believe with all my heart that in their heart they really thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were doing what's best for the church. I really do believe that. But they just saw the world differently.
This fella, who, by the way, was on the hospitality committee, came up to the pulpit. I had just announced the first hymn. He came up and shoved me out of the way.
And he essentially took over the microphone and started talking about all the bad things that were going to happen at the church as a result of this transition.
He grabs the pulpit like this and he says, "You think you have come here to hear a sermon. You have come to see a funeral."
But some little lady who was watching the program called the police and said, "There's a black-bearded hippie taking over the worship service at the First Baptist Church."
And down to the right front of me, a gentleman with white silver hair, I still remember, stood up and began singing a cappella, "Onward Christian Soldiers," all by himself. And the congregation stood up and joined his singing, and drowned out this gentleman on the platform.
I think looking back on it now, I understand it's because it was a spiritual battle for the life of this church and for the future of this church in this city, and now we understand the church around the world.
Well, one of the things that I learned from all that was, if you know what the will of God is, you stand no matter what, and God will stand with you. And as I look back over that battle and other battles that I've been through, it's a matter of trusting Him. You don't fight, you trust Him and you obey Him and watch Him work.